For 20 years, I thought my dad was dead. But then one random Facebook post turned my entire world upside down. I was 7 years old when my mom dropped the news that would shape the way I saw my childhood and my dad forever. It was a quiet afternoon, one of those lazy Sundays where the world felt like it was on pause. I was in the living room, sprawled out on the carpet, playing with my action figures. My mom came in, her face unusually serious. She sat down on the couch and patted the cushion beside her. "Come here, sweetheart," she said softly. Her tone was strange, and even at 7 I could tell something was off. I put my toys down and sat beside her, swinging my legs nervously. She took my hand in hers and looked me in the eye. Her own eyes were glassy, brimming with unshed tears. "Your dad passed away," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. I stared at her, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Passed away didn't mean much to me back then. All I knew was that it sounded permanent. My dad wasn't coming back.
"Why?"
I whispered, tears filling my own eyes now. She pulled me into a hug, stroking my hair.
"He loved you so much," she said.
"But sometimes life doesn't go the way we want. He's in a better place now." I cried into her shoulder, not fully understanding but knowing enough to feel the loss. After that day, we didn't talk about him much. It was like he became a shadow in our lives, a presence that lingered but was never directly acknowledged. As the years went by, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. For one, there were no pictures of him anywhere in the house. Not on the walls, not in photo albums, not even tucked away in drawers. Whenever I asked about him, my mom would give vague, rehearsed answers. "He was a good man," she'd say. Or, "He loved you very much." But that was it. No stories about their life together, no details about what kind of person he was. Just those same 2 lines, repeated like a mantra. I figured it was too painful for her to talk about, so I stopped asking. Still, the question stayed with me, growing louder as I got older. Why didn't we have any of his belongings? Why didn't we visit his grave? Every time I brought it up, my mom would change the subject or brush me off. Once, when I was about 10, I asked her point blank why there weren't any pictures of him. She froze for a moment, then shrugged. "They got lost during a move," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It happens." It was a simple answer, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right. There was an edge to her voice, like she was hiding something. I wanted to push, to ask more, but the look on her face stopped me. She looked scared almost. And so I let it go. By the time I was a teenager, I'd learned not to ask about my dad at all. It wasn't worth the tension it brought into the room. But the mystery of him still gnawed at me. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what little I knew. My friends would talk about their dads, what they did for work, the funny things they said, the advice they gave. I had nothing to add to those conversations. All I could do was sit there, nodding along, and pretend it didn't bother me. But it did. I'd sometimes catch myself daydreaming about him, imagining what he was like. Did he have my sense of humor? My stubborn streak? Did he look like me? Without pictures, I had no idea. All I had were fragments of a man I didn't really know, a name, a vague memory of his absence, and the idea that he'd once loved me. And yet, there was a part of me that couldn't let go of the feeling that something wasn't right. My mom's story was too neat, too incomplete. It felt like there were holes in it, gaps that didn't make sense. I didn't know it yet, but those gaps were about to unravel my entire world. It was a random Saturday when everything started to unravel. I was 24 back home for the weekend, and my mom had roped me into cleaning out the attic. She'd been talking about decluttering for years, but somehow, it had never actually happened. That day, she seemed unusually determined to get it done. "You're young. You can climb up there," she said, handing me a flashlight and a pair of gloves. "Just bring down anything that looks important." The attic was cramped and dusty, with cobwebs stretched across the beams like little ghost traps. Most of the boxes were labeled in my mom's neat handwriting: Christmas, baby clothes, kitchen. I was halfway through a stack when I came across a plain, unmarked box shoved into the corner. It was heavier than I expected, and when I opened it, the smell of old paper and mildew hit me immediately. Inside were random odds and ends, a few of my childhood toys, some yellowed documents, and, tucked beneath it all, a single photograph. I pulled it out, squinting at the faded image. It showed a man in his late 20s or early 30s, sitting on a park bench. He had dark hair and a crooked smile, and he was holding a baseball cap in his hands. He didn't look familiar at first, but the more I stared, the more I saw it. His nose was the same as mine. His eyes, too. I climbed down from the attic, the photo in my hand. "Hey, Mom," I called out, walking into the living room. She was sorting through another pile of stuff, humming softly to herself. "Who's this?" I asked, holding up the picture. The moment she saw it, her face went blank. For a few seconds, it was like she didn't know what to say. Then, in a quick, almost robotic motion, she reached for the photo, snatched it out of my hand, and shoved it back into the box I'd brought down. "No one important," she said, her voice tight. Her reaction caught me off guard. "What do you mean, no one important? He looks like me." "It's just someone your uncle knew," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Forget about it."
Mom.
"Drop it," she snapped, louder this time. She closed the box, stood up, and carried it toward the garage. "I'll take care of this one. Go finish the attic." I didn't follow her, but my mind was racing. That wasn't just no one important. I could feel it. Whoever that man was, he meant something. That night, the photo haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face staring back at me. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. Could it be my dad? I tried to shake the thought. My dad was dead. My mom had said so, hadn't she? But the more I thought about it, the more questions bubbled to the surface. Why had she reacted so strongly? Why had she lied about who the man was? And why didn't we have any other photos of my dad? I couldn't let it go. After my mom went to bed, I pulled out my laptop and started digging. I typed my dad's name into Google. No results. I tried Facebook next, scrolling through endless profiles that didn't match. It was like he'd never existed. Frustrated, I tried variations of his name, nicknames, initials, even misspellings, but it was no use. There were no traces of him, anywhere. No social media profiles, no obituaries, nothing. The whole thing was starting to feel surreal. How could someone just disappear like that? Even if he'd died young, there should have been something. A record, a mention, a photo in an old yearbook. But there was nothing, and that only made me more suspicious. The next day, I brought it up again, hoping my mom would be more open after a night's sleep. "Hey, about that photo," I started, trying to sound casual. She cut me off before I could finish. "I told you it's not important."
"It is to me," I said.
"He looks like me, Mom." "Is he my dad?" Her face hardened, and for a moment, I thought she was going to yell. But instead, she just turned away, busying herself with the dishes. "Your dad is gone," she said quietly. "There's no point in digging up the past." I wanted to argue, to demand the truth, but something in her tone stopped me. She sounded tired, defeated. Like the conversation itself was too much for her. I dropped it for the moment, but deep down I knew I couldn't leave it alone. There was something she wasn't telling me, something bigger than just a forgotten photo in an attic. And I was going to find out what it was. It had been a few months since I found the photo in the attic, and although my mom's sharp dismissal lingered in the back of my mind, life carried on as usual, or at least it seemed to. I threw myself into work and tried not to think about it, but every so often, I'd catch myself staring at the ceiling late at night, imagining the man in the picture.
Who was he?
Why had my mom reacted so strongly? And why did he look so much like me? Despite my efforts to let it go, the mystery lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my closest friends. Something about the whole situation felt too fragile, like if I said it out loud, it would shatter into a million pieces. But the questions kept building, slowly and steadily, until they felt too big to ignore. One evening, I was mindlessly scrolling through Facebook, doing the usual rounds of liking posts and ignoring ads, when I saw it, a people you may know suggestion that stopped me cold. The man in the profile picture looked eerily familiar. He was older, with streaks of gray in his hair and faint wrinkles around his eyes, but the resemblance was undeniable. It was the same nose, the same eyes, the same crooked smile, the same face I'd seen in that attic photo months ago. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I clicked on the profile, my heart pounding so loudly, I could hear it in my ears. His name was different from the one I'd grown up hearing, Mark instead of Michael, but everything else about him felt right. He lived in a small town in another state, one I'd never been to, and his profile was public enough that I could see some of his posts. There were pictures of him fishing, playing with a dog, and posing with a woman who looked to be his wife. There was even a photo of two teenage kids, a boy and a girl, with captions that referred to them as my kids.
Kids.
My stomach turned. Did that mean they were my half-siblings? I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, my mind spinning. Could this really be him? Could this man, who seemed very much alive, actually be the dad my mom had sworn was dead? I scrolled through his profile obsessively, trying to piece together his life from the fragments he'd shared online. He seemed normal, happy even. He wasn't hiding away or living off the grid. He was just there, living a life that seemed completely ordinary. I went back to the attic photo in my mind, comparing it to the man on my screen. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. It had to be him. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I hovered over the message button, my finger trembling. 100 different thoughts ran through my head at once. What if I was wrong? What if this wasn't him, and I was about to make a complete fool of myself? But what if I was right? I clicked the button and started typing. At first, I deleted every line I wrote, unsure of how to say what I needed to say. After about 10 minutes of agonizing over the words, I finally settled on something simple. Hi. This might sound strange, but I think you might be my dad. After I hit send, I stared at the screen, waiting for a response. Minutes ticked by, then hours. Nothing. The next day, I checked my messages first thing in the morning, but still, there was no reply. I told myself it was fine, that maybe he hadn't seen it yet. But as the days turned into a week, my confidence began to waver. Maybe he thought I was some scammer or a troll. Maybe he had seen it and decided to ignore it. By the second week, I had almost given up hope. I tried to focus on other things, but every time I opened Facebook, I found myself checking his profile again, looking for any sign that he might have read my message. Then, one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was him. His reply was short and to the point. I think you're mistaken. I don't know you.
My heart sank.
I stared at the message, reading it over and over, hoping I'd missed something. But it was clear. He was denying it. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. I typed a reply, my fingers flying over the keyboard. My name is your name. My mom is her name. She told me my dad passed away when I was a kid. I found a photo of you, and you look just like the man in the picture. Please, can we just talk? This time, the response wasn't immediate. Hours went by, then a full day. I kept checking my phone, each moment of silence stretching out like an eternity. When his reply finally came, it was a single sentence that made my stomach drop. I need some time to think about this. Please don't contact me again for now. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was devastated. This man, who I was almost certain was my dad, had essentially shut the door in my face. But another part of me was filled with determination. His response wasn't a firm no. If anything, it felt like he was trying to process something. I decided to respect his request for space, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Why would he need time to think about it if he truly didn't know me? For now, all I could do was wait. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the search. After hitting send on that first message, I had prepared myself for the worst. Honestly, I didn't expect much. A response felt like a long shot, and even if he did reply, what were the chances it would lead to anything? This man, Mark, who I was almost certain was my dad, had an entire life I knew nothing about. For all I knew, he might have seen my message, laughed it off, and moved on with his day. Still, a small part of me clung to hope. Maybe he would reply, and maybe, just maybe, he would confirm everything I suspected. When his message finally came 2 days later, I was in the middle of making dinner. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen absent-mindedly. But when I saw his name pop up in my notifications, my heart skipped a beat. With shaky hands, I opened the app and read his reply. I think you're mistaken. I don't know you. That was it. 7 words. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Disappointment, confusion, anger. All of them hit me at once. His denial felt too quick, too absolute, like he hadn't even stopped to consider what I was saying. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he really didn't remember my mom. Maybe I was wrong about everything, and this was just some random man who happened to look like me. But deep down, I didn't believe that. There were too many coincidences, too many things pointing to him being my dad. I wasn't ready to give up. After pacing around my apartment for half an hour, I sat back down and typed out another message. My name is your name. My mom is her name. She told me my dad passed away when I was a kid. I found a photo of you, and you look just like the man in the picture. Please, can we just talk? Do you know hers? This time, I took a deep breath before hitting send. My heart raced as I watched the screen, half expecting him to block me immediately. The reply didn't come as quickly as the first one. Hours passed, then a full day. By the second evening, I'd convinced myself he wasn't going to respond at all. I told myself it was fine, that I'd tried my best, but the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. When his message finally appeared, it caught me completely off guard. "I need some time to think about this," it read. "Please don't contact me again for now." I reread the message at least 10 times, trying to make sense of it. He didn't deny knowing my mom this time, which felt significant. But what did he need time to think about? If he truly didn't know me, wouldn't he just say so and move on? The ambiguity of his words was maddening. It felt like he was dangling answers just out of reach, leaving me in limbo. I wanted to message him again, to demand clarity, but I also didn't want to push him away completely. So I did the hardest thing I could do. I waited. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. I found myself obsessively checking Facebook, scrolling through his profile again and again, looking for clues I might have missed. I tried to read between the lines of his posts, searching for hidden messages or hints about his past. In one photo, he was standing in front of a lake holding a fishing rod. In another, he was at a backyard barbecue with his family, laughing as he flipped burgers. There was nothing unusual about any of it, just a man living an ordinary life. But the more I looked, the more questions I had. Did his family know about me? Did his wife know about my mom? Did he ever think about the life he might have had if things had gone differently? I couldn't sit still. The waiting was driving me crazy, and the more time passed, the more certain I became that there was more to his story. My mom's reaction to the photo in the attic had been so visceral, so immediate. She knew something she wasn't telling me, and now I was almost certain Mark did too. But why were they hiding it? What were they so afraid of? Finally, after a week of agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront my mom again. I drove over to her house, rehearsing what I was going to say the entire way there. When I arrived, she was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, but her smile faded the moment I brought up the attic photo. "Mom, I need you to be honest with me," I said, my voice firm. "Who is he?" Her hands froze mid-chop. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face pale and unreadable. "I told you," she said quietly. "He's no one important." "Stop saying that." I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "He's not no one."
I found him, Mom.
"I found him on Facebook, and he looks just like me. He lives in state. He has a family. And he's alive." The last word hung in the air like a bomb. Her knife clattered to the counter, and she leaned heavily against the edge of the sink. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but then she straightened up and met my eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking. "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me what's going on, because I'm tired of being lied to." She opened her mouth to say something, but stopped herself. Instead, she turned away and started washing the vegetables, her movements robotic and tense. "I can't do this right now," she said finally. That night, I sat in my car for a long time before driving home, replaying the conversation over and over in my head. It was clear my mom wasn't ready to tell me the truth, but I wasn't going to let it go. And as for Mark, whether he wanted to talk to me or not, I wasn't giving up on him either. By the time I worked up the courage to confront my mom, I was a ball of nerves. Every time I imagined the conversation, my chest tightened with dread. What if she doubled down on her lies? What if she denied everything? But no matter how much I dreaded it, I couldn't keep quiet any longer. The Facebook discovery, the messages, the uncanny resemblance, all of it was too much to ignore. I showed up at her house unannounced, heart racing. She opened the door and gave me a puzzled look. "What's wrong?" she asked, sensing my mood immediately. "Can we talk?" I said, stepping past her into the living room before she could respond. She followed me, her concern deepening. "What's going on?" I sat down on the couch and took a deep breath. "I need you to tell me the truth about Dad." Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. "What are you talking about?" "I found someone on Facebook," I said, diving in before I lost my nerve. "He looks just like me, Mom. I messaged him, and he says he doesn't know me, but I think he's lying. I think he's my dad." She sank into the armchair across from me, her hands gripping the edges of the seat. For a long moment, she didn't say a word. Her eyes darted around the room, as if she was searching for a way out of the conversation. "Why would you think that?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because he looks exactly like the photo I found in the attic," I said, my frustration bubbling over. The one you told me was no one important. And because you've been acting like you're hiding something ever since I was a kid." Her hands trembled as she rubbed them together. "I told you your dad passed away," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Stop lying to me," I snapped, louder than I intended. "I know he's alive, Mom. Just tell me the truth. Please." She flinched at my tone, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying. Instead, she took a deep, shuddering breath and looked me in the eye. "You're right," she said finally.
"He's alive."
The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat there, stunned, as everything I thought I knew about my life crumbled around me. Why would you tell me he was dead?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. "When you were a baby, your dad and I had a horrible breakup. It wasn't just arguments, it was shouting matches, accusations, tears. He wasn't ready to be a father, and I wasn't about to force him to stay when he clearly didn't want to." I stared at her, my mind racing. "So, he left?" She nodded, her shoulders slumping.
"He left."
I tried to make it work, but he told me he wasn't cut out for it. He said it was better for both of us if he stayed away. "I didn't want you to grow up wondering why your dad didn't love you enough to stay, so I made a decision. I told you he was gone for good." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You told me he was dead," I said, my voice rising again. "You didn't just say he left. You said he died." She winced, tears streaming down her face now.
"I know," she said.
"And I'm sorry. I thought it would be easier for you to believe that he couldn't come back than to know that he chose not to." Her words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on my chest. On one hand, I could understand why she made the choice she did. On the other, I felt betrayed in a way I couldn't put into words. "Do you know what it was like growing up without any answers?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I used to lie awake at night imagining what kind of person he was, wondering if I'd ever be good enough to make him proud. And all this time, he was alive." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said. "I thought I was protecting you." "Well, you didn't," I said harshly, standing up. "You lied to me, Mom. For years." She looked up at me, her face crumpled with guilt. "I know," she said, "and I can't undo that. But believe me when I say I only wanted what was best for you." I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand answers to questions I hadn't even thought of yet. But seeing her like that, broken, remorseful, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I turned to leave. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice panicked. "I need time to think," I said. Just like he does. As I drove home, my emotions swung wildly between anger, sadness, and something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. For years, I'd felt like something was missing, like there was a hole in my life I couldn't fill. Now I finally had answers, messy, complicated answers, but answers nonetheless. But they only raised more questions. If my dad had left, why hadn't he ever tried to reach out? Did he know about the lie my mom had told me? And most importantly, did he ever think about me at all? I didn't know if I was ready to confront him again, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. For days after my mom's confession, I felt like I was living in a fog. My mind kept replaying her words. He's alive. The man I had spent my entire life grieving was out there somewhere, living his life as if I didn't exist. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. Why would he leave? Why hadn't he ever tried to find me? And most of all, why did my mom think it was better to tell me he was dead than to let me know the truth? I went back and forth between anger, sadness, and a strange kind of numbness. I wanted to confront my mom again, to push her for more answers, but I knew she had already told me everything she was willing to share. Every time I tried to bring it up again, she would shut down completely, her face crumpling into that same haunted expression. So I turned my focus back to the man on Facebook, the man I was almost certain was my dad. It had been weeks since I'd sent him that second message, and his response, or lack of one, had left me in limbo. His words still echoed in my mind. "I need some time to think about this. Please don't contact me again for now." What did that even mean? If he really didn't know me, why would he need time to think? And if he did know me, why wouldn't he just admit it? I couldn't let it go. One night, unable to sleep, I pulled out my laptop and opened Facebook. His profile was still public, and I scrolled through it again, studying every detail like it held the key to some great mystery. I stared at his family photos. The ones with the woman I assumed was his wife, and the 2 teenagers who might be my half-siblings. I imagined what it would be like to grow up with them, to be part of a family that I didn't even know existed until now. Then I opened the photo I'd found in the attic. The resemblance was undeniable. The man in the old, faded picture and the man in these Facebook posts were the same person. I was sure of it. I decided to try one last time. If he was my dad, he owed me an explanation. And if he wasn't, I needed to know for sure so I could move on. I drafted a new message, taking my time to choose my words carefully. Hi, it's me again. I know you told me not to contact you, but I really need answers. My mom recently admitted that my dad is alive, and I believe you might be him. She told me some things about their relationship, and I'd really like to hear your side of the story. I've attached a photo I found of you. Please take a look. All I want is the truth. I hesitated for a moment before hitting send. Then I attached the attic photo, the one of him sitting on a park bench, and sent the message. This time, I didn't obsessively check my phone for a reply. I told myself I wouldn't get my hopes up. If he ignored me again, or worse, blocked me, I'd accept that as my answer. But days turned into weeks, and as the silence dragged on, my resolve began to waver. Maybe this was the end of the road. Maybe I was destined to never know the full truth about my dad. Then, one afternoon, as I was getting ready to leave for work, my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was just a notification from some app. But when I saw his name on the screen, I froze. The message was short: "We need to meet. I'll explain everything." My heart pounded as I reread the message, trying to process what it meant. He wanted to meet? Did that mean he was my dad? Or was he just trying to clear up some misunderstanding? I typed out a quick reply: "When and where?" His response came almost immediately: "There's a diner. Can you meet me there on Saturday at 2 p.m.? I agreed, my hands shaking as I typed. Part of me was terrified of what he might say, of what I might learn. But another part of me was relieved. After all the years of questions, the lies, and the half-truths, I was finally going to get answers. The days leading up to the meeting felt like an eternity. I couldn't focus on anything else. My mind kept running through every possible scenario. What if he denied being my dad again? What if he told me something I didn't want to hear? On the other hand, what if he confirmed it? What if he admitted that he was my dad and explained everything: why he left, why he stayed away, why my mom lied to me? By the time Saturday rolled around, I was a wreck. I barely ate that morning, and the drive to the diner felt surreal, like I was floating outside of my own body. When I arrived, the place was nearly empty. A waitress greeted me at the door, and I scanned the room until I saw him sitting in a booth near the back. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment, our eyes met. I felt a jolt of recognition, something deep and instinctive, like a part of me already knew the truth. "Hi," I said, sliding into the booth across from him. My voice sounded small, almost shaky. "Hi," he said, his expression guarded. He looked nervous, like he wasn't sure what to say. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I replied. He nodded, then hesitated. "I know you have questions," he said, "and you deserve answers." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "Are you my dad?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the table, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to summon the courage to speak. Finally, he looked up and said, "Yes, I am." Hearing him say it out loud was both a relief and a gut punch. I didn't know whether to be angry, happy, or just overwhelmed. My whole life, I'd been living with a lie, and now, here he was real and alive, sitting across from me. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you ever try to find me?" He sighed, leaning back in his seat. "It's a long story," he said. "And it's not as simple as you might think." "I've got time," I said. And with that, he began to tell me everything. The small cafe where we'd agreed to meet was tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. As I pulled into the parking lot, I realized my hands were shaking. I had spent the entire drive here rehearsing what I was going to say, but now, sitting in my car, it all felt inadequate. What do you say to the man you've spent your entire life wondering about? To the father you thought was dead? I took a deep breath, glanced at myself in the rearview mirror, and forced myself out of the car. My legs felt like jelly as I walked into the cafe, the door chiming softly as it swung open. He was already there, sitting at a corner table near the window. He looked older than the man in the attic photo, but there was no mistaking him. The same dark hair, now streaked with gray. The same nose. The same eyes, my eyes. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. He glanced up and saw me, and I could see the recognition in his face. He gave a small, tentative smile and gestured for me to come over. "Hi," I said, sliding into the chair across from him. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. "Hi," he said back. We sat there in silence for a few seconds, both of us clearly unsure how to start. I studied him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the idea of a father I'd carried in my head all these years. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with a coffee cup in front of him. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I don't know where to start. How about the truth?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He winced but nodded. Fair enough. For the next hour, he told me his side of the story. He started at the beginning, how he and my mom had met when they were both in their early 20s. "We were young," he said, staring down at the table. "Too young to know what we wanted. But things moved fast. She got pregnant with you, and everything changed." He told me how their relationship had started to fall apart not long after I was born. "We loved each other, but it wasn't a healthy kind of love," he said. "We fought all the time. About money, about how to raise you, about everything. Eventually, it reached a breaking point. Your mom told me I wasn't cut out to be a father," he said. "And honestly, she wasn't wrong. I was immature, selfish. I didn't know how to handle the responsibility, and I made a lot of mistakes." He paused, his eyes heavy with regret. "When we split, she made it clear she didn't want me around. She said it would be easier for both of you if I stayed away. And at the time, I believed her. I thought she was right, that you'd be better off without me." Hearing him say those words made my chest tighten with a mix of anger and sadness. "You just left," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You didn't even try?" "I did try," he said quickly. "At first, I sent letters, tried to call. But your mom wouldn't respond. Eventually, I took the hint. I figured she didn't want me in your life, and I didn't want to make things harder for you." I stared at him, trying to process everything he was saying. On one hand, his story made sense. On the other hand, it felt like a cop-out. "You could have fought for me," I said quietly. "You could have tried harder." He nodded, his face full of guilt. "You're right," he said. "I could have. I should have. But I was scared. I told myself I was doing the right thing, but the truth is, I was just being a coward." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. I looked out the window, watching people walk by, while he stared down at his coffee cup. "I didn't know your mom told you I was dead," he said finally. "If I'd known, I don't know. Maybe I would have done things differently." The words stung. They felt like too little, too late. But at the same time, there was a strange kind of relief in hearing him admit his mistakes. At least now I had answers. "Why didn't you ever try to find me?" I asked. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I did, once," he said. "When you were about 10. I came back to town, hoping to see you. But your mom made it clear that I wasn't welcome. She said you were happy and she didn't want me disrupting your life." I clenched my fists under the table. The thought of my mom actively keeping him away from me made my blood boil. "She lied to both of us," I said bitterly. "She did what she thought was best," he said. "It doesn't make it right, but I don't think she was trying to hurt you." We talked for a while longer, but by the time we finished, I still didn't know how to feel. I was angry at him for leaving, angry at my mom for lying, and angry at the universe for putting me in this situation. But I was also relieved. After years of questions and half-truths, I finally had some clarity. Before we left, he looked me in the eye and said, "I know I can't make up for the years we lost, but I want to try. If you'll let me." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. As I drove home, I replayed the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it all. My dad, my real living dad, wanted to be part of my life. And for the first time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I wanted that too. After meeting my dad, I thought I'd finally have some closure. I expected to feel lighter, like the weight of all those unanswered questions would finally lift. But the relief I felt was short-lived. Instead of providing clarity, my dad's side of the story only raised more questions. He'd been honest, or so it seemed, but there were gaps in his narrative that didn't add up. For one, he told me he never paid child support because my mom refused to take his money. He claimed he offered repeatedly, but she made it clear she didn't want anything from him. When I brought this up to my mom, expecting her to confirm or at least explain. She flatly denied it. "He never offered me a dime," she said, her voice tinged with anger. "If he had, don't you think I would have taken it? Do you know how hard it was raising you on my own?" The contradiction left me spinning. One of them was lying, and I didn't know who to believe. The deeper I dug, the more cracks I found in their stories. My mom insisted she had done everything she could to protect me from a man who didn't want to be a father. "He abandoned us," she said over and over, as if repeating it would make it true. But my dad painted a different picture. He claimed he left because my mom pushed him away. "She told me you didn't need me," he said during our meeting. "She said I was only going to mess things up for you." Both of them seemed convinced they were in the right, but their versions of the past were completely at odds with each other. It felt like I was trapped in the middle of a Cold War I hadn't even known existed. I started going through old family records, hoping to find something that might clarify the truth. Most of what I found was mundane: school report cards, medical records, a few tax documents, but there were some surprises too. I found a hospital bill from the year I was born, listing both my mom's and dad's names. It was strange seeing their names side by side, like a snapshot of a life that had ended before I even understood it. There were also a few legal documents from the custody agreement they'd signed when they split. The agreement stated that my dad had visitation rights, but according to my mom, he never used them. "He didn't show up," she said when I asked about it. "Not once." Do you know what that felt like? Watching you wait for him, knowing he wasn't coming. When I confronted my dad about this, his response was completely different. "She blocked me from seeing you," he said. "Every time I tried to schedule a visit, she'd cancel or make up an excuse. Eventually, I gave up trying because I didn't want to make things harder for you." It was maddening. How could two people have such wildly different recollections of the same events? My frustration grew as I realized neither of them was willing to take full responsibility for what had happened. They both seemed stuck in their own narratives, unwilling or unable to see the other side. "Maybe they're both lying," my best friend, Sarah, suggested when I vented to her one night. "Or maybe they're both telling the truth, in their own way." "What does that even mean?" I asked, exasperated. "It means memories are tricky," she said. "People remember things the way they want to, especially when it comes to something painful. Your mom might honestly believe she did everything she could, and your dad might honestly believe she kept him away. Doesn't mean either of them is completely right or completely wrong." Her words stuck with me. Could it really be that simple? That they were both victims of their own distorted memories? The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. One evening, while scrolling through Facebook, I stumbled across an old comment on one of my dad's photos. It was from someone I didn't recognize, a man named Greg, who wrote, "Glad to see you happy now. You've come a long way from those messy days in my hometown." The comment struck me as odd. What messy days was he talking about? I clicked on Greg's profile, and after some digging, I found out he'd been friends with my dad for years. I decided to message him. "Hi, I'm my name," I wrote. "I'm trying to learn more about my dad's past, and I saw your comment on one of his posts. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" To my surprise, Greg replied almost immediately. "Sure," he wrote. "What do you want to know?" We ended up talking for over an hour. Greg told me that my dad had gone through a rough patch in his 20s, around the time I was born. He was in a bad place, Greg said. He'd just split up with your mom, and he was struggling to get his life together. There was a lot of drama between them. When I asked him to elaborate, Greg hesitated. "I don't want to speak out of turn," he said. "But there were rumors about why your mom didn't want him around. Some people said it was because he was partying too much. Others said it was because of money problems. I don't know the full story, but it was messy." The conversation left me with even more questions. Had my dad been involved in something he wasn't telling me about? And if so, had that played a role in why he left, or why my mom pushed him away? By this point, I felt like a detective piecing together a mystery. Every answer I found only seemed to lead to more questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper truth both of them were hiding, something neither of them wanted me to know. I decided to confront them separately one last time. First, I called my dad. "Is there anything you're not telling me?" I asked bluntly. "Greg mentioned that things were messy when you left."
What was he talking about?
There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I made some mistakes back then," he said finally. "I wasn't perfect. But I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I thought it was the best thing for you. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was something." When I confronted my mom, her reaction was more defensive. "Why are you still digging this up?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I told you everything you need to know." No, you didn't, I said. You told me your version of the truth. But there's more to the story, isn't there? She didn't respond right away. Instead, she crossed her arms and stared at me, her expression unreadable. Some things are better left in the past, she said finally. Her words only fueled my determination. Whatever secrets they were hiding, I was going to uncover them, even if it meant tearing apart the fragile truths I'd just begun to build. By this point, I had grown used to finding more questions than answers. Every thread I pulled unraveled into a mess of contradictions, half-truths, and things left unsaid. It was exhausting, but I couldn't stop. The deeper I dug, the more I felt like I was on the brink of discovering something that would finally make all of it, my dad's absence, my mom's lies, make sense. One day, as I was scrolling through my dad's Facebook profile for what felt like the millionth time, I noticed a comment I hadn't seen before. It was on a family photo, an old picture of him with his wife and kids, smiling in front of what looked like a vacation cabin. The comment read, "So glad you're happy now. You deserve this after everything that happened in my hometown." My hometown. The words stopped me cold. Most of my dad's Facebook friends were from the state where he now lived, people who seemed to have no connection to his life before he left. But this comment suggested otherwise. Whoever this person was, they knew something about his past, something that tied directly to the town where I grew up. The commenter's name was Brenda, and her profile was public enough for me to learn a few things. She was older, probably in her late 50s or early 60s, and her post suggested she had known my dad for a long time. She'd commented on several of his pictures over the years, always with a tone of familiarity, like they were old friends. I debated for a while before messaging her. It felt risky. What if she told my dad I was snooping? But curiosity won out, as it always seemed to these days. "Hi, Brenda," I wrote. "I'm my dad's son. I noticed your comment on one of his photos, and I was wondering if you might be able to tell me more about what happened when he lived in my hometown. I'm trying to piece together some things about his past." It was a shot in the dark, but to my surprise, she replied almost immediately. Brenda was cautious at first, asking me why I was digging into my dad's past. I explained, in broad strokes, that I had recently reconnected with him after years of estrangement and was trying to understand why he left. Her tone softened after that. "Your dad's a good man," she wrote. "But he went through some tough times back then. A lot of people did." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. She hesitated before replying. "I don't want to get into too much detail. It's not my place to share everything, but let's just say there were circumstances that made it hard for him to stay in town. He got caught up in some shady business dealings. Nothing violent, but things that could have gotten him in a lot of trouble if they'd come to light." I stared at the screen, her words blurring in my mind. Shady business dealings? Trouble? This was the first I'd heard of anything like this. "What kind of dealings?" I pressed. She didn't elaborate much, but she confirmed enough to paint a picture. My dad had been struggling financially after splitting from my mom, and at some point, he got involved in what she called a bad crowd. According to Brenda, he'd been desperate to make ends meet and had made some poor decisions that eventually caught up with him. "It's all in the past now," she wrote. "He's a different person these days. But back then, he had no choice but to leave. It was safer for everyone." I thanked Brenda for her honesty, but her message left me shaken. This wasn't the story my dad had told me. He'd made it sound like his departure was a clean break, a mutual decision between him and my mom for my benefit. But this was something entirely different. That night, I called him. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and slightly cautious, as if he could sense the weight of what I was about to say. "Why didn't you tell me the real reason you left?" I asked, skipping the small talk. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" he said finally. "I talked to someone who knows you," I said. "They told me about the shady business dealings, about how you had to leave town because of it." Another pause, this one heavier. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Who told you that?" "It doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you've been lying to me. Why didn't you tell me the truth?" He sighed, the kind of deep, weary sigh that comes from carrying a burden for too long. "Because it doesn't matter anymore," he said. "It was a long time ago, and it's not who I am now." "It matters to me," I shot back. "I've been trying to understand why you left, why you stayed away, and now I find out it wasn't just about you and Mom, that there was more to it." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Fine. You want the truth?" "Yes, I got involved in some things I'm not proud of." After your mom and I split, I was broke, I was desperate, and I made some bad choices. I got involved with people who were running illegal operations, mostly scams, nothing dangerous, but enough to land me in serious trouble if I got caught. When things started to unravel, I had two options: stay and face the consequences, or leave and start over somewhere new. I chose to leave because I didn't want that life for you. I thought it was better to stay away than risk dragging you into my mess. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know whether to feel angry, sad, or just numb. On one hand, I could understand his reasoning. He'd made a terrible mistake, and he thought he was protecting me by leaving. But on the other hand, it felt like yet another excuse, another way to avoid taking responsibility. You should have told me, I said finally. You should have been honest with me from the start. I know, he said quietly. But I was ashamed. I didn't want you to think less of me. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to yell at him, to tell him that he'd already lost my respect by leaving. But another part of me, the part that still wanted to know my dad, understood why he'd kept it hidden. I'm sorry, he said. For everything. For leaving, for lying, for not being there when you needed me. I wish I could go back and do things differently, but I can't. All I can do now is try to make things right. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, trying to process everything. My dad wasn't the person I had imagined growing up, neither the hero I'd hoped for nor the villain I'd sometimes pictured. He was just a man, flawed and complicated, trying to navigate the mess he'd made of his life. I wasn't sure what to do with that realization, but one thing was clear. The story wasn't over yet. In the weeks following my dad's admission, I felt like I was standing at the edge of two completely different lives, trying to figure out how to balance them. On one side was the life I'd always known, the one where my dad was gone, my mom was my sole parent, and the truth was simple, even if it wasn't comforting. On the other side was this new, messy reality. My dad wasn't dead. He wasn't even the absentee monster I'd imagined during my angrier moments. He was a deeply flawed man who had made terrible choices, but wanted to make amends. Neither side felt entirely right, and neither side felt entirely wrong. The first step toward moving forward was deciding how I wanted to handle my relationship with my dad. It wasn't an easy decision. Part of me still resented him for leaving, for letting me grow up without a father, and for waiting until I forced the issue to tell me the truth. But another part of me wanted to give him a chance. We started small. Texts here and there, usually initiated by him. They were often awkward. How's your week going? Or I saw this article and thought of you. But I could tell he was trying. Eventually, he asked if I wanted to meet up again.
Just for lunch, he said.
No pressure. I just want to spend some time with you. I hesitated at first. The idea of sitting across from him, trying to navigate the minefield of our shared past, felt daunting. But I knew that if I wanted to give this relationship a real chance, I had to be willing to take that step. We met at a quiet diner halfway between our towns. This time, the tension between us wasn't as suffocating as it had been during our first meeting. He seemed more relaxed, more open, and I tried to let go of some of the anger I'd been holding on to. We talked about small things, work, hobbies, the weather, but gradually the conversation turned to more meaningful topics. I know I can't undo the past, he said at one point, looking down at his coffee cup. But I want to be part of your life now, if you'll let me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It wasn't an easy thing to say yes to, but I knew I wanted to try. As for my mom, our relationship was harder to repair. I loved her. How could I not? She'd been my rock for most of my life, the person who raised me and supported me through everything. But her lies had left a wound that wasn't going to heal overnight. We had several difficult conversations in the weeks after her confession. I asked her again and again why she hadn't told me the truth, and every time, her answer was the same. I thought I was doing what was best for you. I know you thought you were protecting me, I said during one of these talks. But don't you see how much damage it caused? I spent my whole life mourning someone who wasn't even gone. I deserve to know the truth. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes.
You're right, she said.
I should have told you. But I was scared. I was scared that if you knew he was out there, you'd blame me for keeping him away. I didn't want you to hate me. Her words broke my heart. I didn't hate her, I couldn't. But I couldn't deny the pain her decisions had caused me, either. Over time, I began to understand that my mom and dad had both been doing the best they could with the hand they were dealt. Their choices had been flawed, and their actions had hurt me in ways they hadn't fully considered. But I could see now that neither of them had acted out of malice. Life isn't black and white, I realized. It's messy and complicated, full of mistakes and regrets. People do the wrong things for the right reasons or the right things for the wrong reasons, and the lines between good and bad blur until it's impossible to tell which is which. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it made it easier to start letting go of some of the anger. My relationship with my dad is still a work in progress. We talk regularly now, and we've even started to bond over shared interests, things we didn't know we had in common until we started getting to know each other. It's not perfect, and there are days when the weight of the past feels almost too heavy to bear. But we're trying, and that counts for something. My relationship with my mom is also slowly healing. She's made an effort to be more open with me, to answer my questions honestly instead of brushing them off. It hasn't been easy, but I can see that she's trying, and I'm trying too. In the end, I've had to make peace with the fact that I'll never get the full truth. Both of my parents have their own versions of the past, and the reality probably lies somewhere in between. What I do know is this: they both made decisions that shaped my life in ways I couldn't control. But those decisions don't define me. I'm still figuring out what it means to rebuild these relationships, to accept the flaws in the people I love without letting them overshadow everything else. It's messy and complicated, but it's real. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally starting to move forward.